Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Jennifer Aument. I'm the Group General Manager North America for Transurban. Transurban is an international infrastructure investor and toll road operator based in Melbourne, Australia, actually. And I say that incorrectly, I understand, for those of you from Victoria, Melbourne, right? It just doesn't feel right with the accent. But it's a real pleasure to be here, particularly with some of my colleagues who have made the 12,000 mile trip to be here, and it's 4:45 in the afternoon, and I know exactly how you're feeling right now, and I bet it's just miserable. So hang in there with me. So I thought I'd come down off the podium a little bit. I see the one in the back, but I'll come down off the podium and have a little bit of a discussion about public-private partnerships and the challenges that we're facing here in the U.S., the opportunity that we believe exists here in utilizing public-private partnerships to help meet our infrastructure needs. And then also I want to really dive a little deeper and go into a specific case study with our 495 and 95 express lanes, which are just a few miles across the river, so you can see some of the concepts that you've been talking about today actually in practice in delivering service to customers, and hopefully bring it to life some of the concepts that you've covered. We'll start with the problem, and I'll be very brief on this because I have a feeling that our Senator Warner covered this slightly in his conversation this morning. We've got some significant challenges in the U.S. when it comes to the infrastructure funding gap and the cost of what has been a decades-long tradition of underinvesting and innovating in our transportation network, despite some really brave, innovative things happening in spot areas with governments across the country. We are grossly behind, and it's coming at a great cost to our quality of life, to our economy, and to our environment, as you can see, and I'm sure you've talked about at length today. Things don't appear to be getting any better. If you look at the funding shortfall, Congress, I don't know if you've noticed I know that we have representatives from around the world, but we have kicked the can down the road in terms of our sustainable funding for transport infrastructure here in the U.S., I think 34 times since President Clinton actually raised the fuels tax during his administration. So we really are grossly behind in trying to fill the infrastructure funding gap with a $168 billion shortfall. Now, I talked to a group of lobbyists this morning. I said, give me your best bet on whether or not Congress is going to solve this problem this fall. And they gave me about a 3% chance. So I can't believe, apparently their marks on Congress's ability to get this done are lower than usual, but we'll see. The industry here in the U.S. is speculating, and perhaps some of you have been among the speculators, that the private sector can play a significant role in the U.S. to help join with government to help meet this transportation need. As you can see there, McKinsey estimates about $2.5 trillion in investment globally through 2030, and Moody's is speculating that the U.S. could be the next IT market when it comes to transportation infrastructure investment. But what we've found, and we'll talk here a little bit in a minute, is a significant amount of private capital out there that could be put to work to improve infrastructure and to help address the challenges that we've outlined earlier. The question is, how do we actually make that happen? And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But first, why do we make that happen? When we look at next generation infrastructure and the role of the private sector, I want to talk to you a little bit about the benefits when it comes to public-private partnerships, specifically the kinds of concessions or demand risk public-private partnerships that Transurban is involved in. Why have a different role for the private sector? Here's an opportunity. If you look at public-private partnerships for toll road infrastructure, there's a number of benefits, and we often focus that discussion around private capital. And you saw this earlier slide, McKinsey and Moody's estimates billions, trillions of dollars of private capital there and ready to invest in infrastructure. But that is just part of the story when it comes to how the private sector can play a ongoing, significant, positive role in the delivery, particularly of highway infrastructure. It goes far beyond private capital. If you look at revenue, certainly we'll talk about the case study on 495 and 95, but the opportunity to inject new capital into the system to ensure that governments can maximize the scarce transportation dollars that they have in place. Debt capacity, when you have particularly risky projects like toll road projects, being able to take that debt off the state government's balance sheet and onto the private sectors, again, an opportunity to free up scarce debt capacity so that we can continue to work together to increase the number of transportation priorities that can be addressed. Risk is certainly big in the toll road space, and I'll show you a specific example on the 495 express lanes. We do public-private partnerships where the risk for traffic and revenue, and I know I've got some modelers in the room, is shifted away from government and away from taxpayers to the private sector. We think that this can be a significant benefit, particularly when we're starting to look at more innovative solutions like managed lanes that become significantly more difficult to predict. When you shift that risk away from government to the private sector, if actual performance does not meet projections, then the private sector, that risk is on the private sector. In the case of the 495 express lanes here in Northern Virginia, the first year we were coming out of the global financial crisis, we were at a fraction of our projections for traffic and revenue, and the private sector at Transurban stepped up, filled that gap at about $280 million at no cost to taxpayers. So an important discussion when talking about public-private partnerships, not just that private sector capital, but also the opportunity to shift key risks when it comes to traffic and revenue, and of course, construction delivery risks as well. Interesting stats coming out of places like the UK, Australia, and the US that also talks about the benefit of really using public-private partnerships to reduce risk during the delivery of major construction projects. There's a great study out of the Department of Transportation in Colorado recently that showed that projects could be delivered for anywhere from 15 to 63% less costly through public-private partnerships. And other studies have suggested that major multi-billion-dollar transportation projects are delivered on time and on budget at far, far greater rates than traditional projects. Not to say that we don't have very talented project managers in the government side, but when you add that commercial component and that commercial tension in there, experience will say that it garners significantly positive results on time and on budget delivery. That certainly has been Transurban's experience here across the river with about $3 billion of infrastructure project all delivered early and under budget. And also life cycle costs. Transferring risk under this model is an opportunity to look at not just the upfront, but to reduce life cycle costs, to take a more innovative approach over the long term in operating infrastructure, and to also ensure that you are thinking about the long term in these concessions. So despite those benefits, the U.S. lags behind the rest of the world in the use of public-private partnerships to deliver and operate our major highway infrastructure. If you can see the latest, Australia, in our company, we have a U.S.-Australian contest on everything, and Australia has certainly outshone the United States in terms of the use of this tool and has great lessons learned that we can apply here in the U.S. on how to bring the private sector in to be able to deliver these public-private partnerships. And the question is, how then in the U.S. do we close that gap? And how do we create an environment where public-private partnerships are more viable options and are used to deliver those appropriate projects? Obviously, it's never going to be a silver bullet. You're never going to be able to use a public-private partnership for everything. But on these large, risky, multi-billion-dollar projects, it is a great opportunity for government to maximize their resources. So how do we create an environment where we can actually do that here in the U.S.? And the first, I think, is looking at what we're looking at on the private side. When we're looking at going into a new market, some of the things that private investors are looking at, as many of you know in the room, we're looking at certainty of process. We're looking at large urban areas when it comes into the highway transportation toll road space. We're looking at minimal political risk or manageable political risk. We're looking at a process where there will be bipartisan support for public-private partnerships. That's certainly in the environment when Transurban looked at the U.S. market. Places like Virginia are high on the list because they have a growing economy, a growing population, heavy congestion, but they also have a stable political environment that is supportive of business and create a consistent process that we can rely on going into the process. From the government's perspective, we've seen governments in the U.S. take efforts to help facilitate these public-private partnerships as well. And I'll have to give states like Florida, Texas, and Virginia a lot of credit for being pathfinders in this area and putting policies in place that really help link those commercial and policy outcomes, partner with the private sector to create projects that make sense under this model, and so they're able to be delivered and deliver results. A couple of things that we've seen these governments do that are successful in promoting public-private partnerships. One, I'll say, is allowing unsolicited proposals. This is something I know that in several of the countries that you come from has been a practice in the past, and it's critically important. From a government perspective, I always talk to our colleagues in government and say, none of us can say we have all the best ideas. So creating a policy environment where you leave the door open for the private sector to come with ideas on how you can meet your policy objectives ensures that you have a lot of brains around that table trying to find solutions to the transportation issues. So there's some controversy around that. Do you really lose control of your policy agenda if you leave the door open for unsolicited? But as long as you put a practice and a policy in place to ensure competition, once those ideas are put on the table, why not leave the door open for some of those good ideas? Other things that the U.S. government has done exceptionally well, and the reason we've started to see close some of this gap, is put in place a number of federal tools that have been real incentives for public-private partnerships in this country. One is the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, which provides low-cost and flexible term loans for these large public-private partnerships, and was intended and has indeed fostered additional private investment in infrastructure here. Another one is private activity bonds, which is another federal program, tax-exempt bonds that level the playing field a bit and are also great incentives to help make these major projects financially feasible. So, and then lastly, at the federal level, one of the developments we've seen here in the U.S. in recent years is the federal government is really stepping up to serve as a resource center for states. Here in the U.S., we really have 50 markets for public-private partnerships, 50 different states with 50 different legislatures and 50 different policy frameworks. And the federal government is currently playing a really critical role in being one-stop shopping for both for policymakers and DOTs across the country to learn about key contract terms and processes and lessons learned and best practices in the public-private partnership space. I've been working in this space in the U.S. market for about 15 years, and I'll tell you that we've come a long way from where we were in the early stages of the industry here in the U.S. in terms of that ability to share best practices. And as you can see, big gap to fill. Private side, public side, we're starting to work together in the U.S. to try to find solutions and align these projects. And if you look at key public-private partnerships in the U.S. for highways since January 2014, you are seeing, that pipeline starting to come together, and we're having real-life examples of how this model, in its various forms, is making progress and to help states meet major transportation needs. Now let's get into the fun part for me, and that's looking at how do we implement some of these innovative finance, technology, and operational strategies and partnership strategies to make a real-life project work. So I'm going to take you here to Northern Virginia. You see Washington, D.C. is the triangle there at the top. What you're looking at is a 45-mile network of managed lanes or high occupancy toll lanes. Now, high occupancy toll lanes are actively managed. They are open to, in at least Virginia and most states across the country, to anyone who has 3 people in their car or HOV3. And then they are also open to those people, those travelers who choose to pay a toll. They operate alongside the regular lanes so that drivers have choices. I'm going to work in the morning. I approach the Capitol Beltway in Virginia. I see a digital message sign that gives me the latest price for that toll option. I can decide in real time whether or not to use that toll lane and get a faster, more reliable trip, or use the regular lane. Or I can choose to carpool with 2 other people in my car and go free 24/7 on that network and get that benefit. As the operator of the lanes, and this is about a $3 billion network, public-private partnership between Transurban and the state of Virginia, as the operator of the lane, my promise to travelers is a faster trip and more reliable trip. That means 65 miles an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on, for instance, the Capitol Beltway, where during rush hour on 8:30 a.m. on a Thursday, the regular lanes might be running at 13 miles an hour. So we're offering a real product and selling a product for those who choose to use it. I'll give you a little sample here. This will show you the 95 express lanes in action. I think there's some fast upbeat music here, but just imagine it in your head.
Pond5.com. 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 Pond5.com.
And look at that visual at the bottom. That hasn't been enhanced. You really do have cars going by at 65, 70 miles an hour while the general purpose lanes or regular lanes are at gridlock. Now, what kinds of next generation transportation strategies are we using to deliver that product to travelers in Northern Virginia? First, you have one of the most technologically advanced roadways in the world. We have sensors that are measuring traffic 24/7, feeding that data into our operations center, where a dynamic tolling algorithm is setting a toll price every 3 minutes, or as often as every 3 minutes, that's necessary to manage the demand and provide that faster and more reliable trip. That takes a whole team of incident response crews that are stationed along the roadway so that if we have incidents, they clear cars freely and quickly, so we keep those high speeds. There's the technology aspect, there's the modeling aspect, there's the continual use of data to ensure that we're addressing issues in the network and providing that consistent trip. That's active management of a roadway in partnership with law enforcement and emergency services to ensure a better service for customers. And so if you look at what that delivers to travelers into the region through these public-private partnerships, economic benefits, creation of this 45-mile network has generated more than nearly $5.5 billion worth of economic activity in this region. Wouldn't have been possible without a public-private partnership. Also, the smallest contribution to small businesses, single contract in the Virginia's history. When it comes to time savings, this is what our customers are experiencing. About 33 minutes on 95, but on last Thursday, our customers paid a toll and saved 3 hours on their commute on 95. If you look at the transit benefits, we have about 560 now bus trips a day. Buses use that network for free, so they're able to move through a congested region, move in and out of heavy rail metro stops, so you have a better integrated transit and highway network in the region. And delivery through that public-private partnerships, you saw the stats earlier as why the model delivers on time, on budget at higher reach than traditional projects. You've seen that play out. Both projects on time, on budget, and what we're most proud of is more than 4.1 million work hours without a loss of work time. So it's safe, it's on time, and it's on budget. And quickly to sum up from a financing perspective, these projects have used both of those tools that I mentioned earlier that are great incentives for public-private partnership here in the U.S., private activity bonds and TIFIA loans. So the federal government is a really critical partner in these projects. By using those federal innovative tools, the private capital, and putting the private capital together, here's what we've enabled the state of Virginia to do. Under 495, with a $409 million upfront investment, we've leveraged that to deliver about $2 billion worth of upfront capital improvements to one of the most congested routes in the country. But then look at that 7.3 billion and 208.8 billion in ongoing O&M costs that we're covering that's off the state's responsibility over the life of the partnership. So significant return on investment for the state. This is how we take scarce transportation dollars and help them do more for travelers by combining the public and private resources. And again, an even more acute example on 95, an $83 million public subsidy investment from the government. Leverage that with private capital to deliver that upfront project, take the responsibility and accountability for that maintenance over the life of the asset, also shifting that risk and shifting that debt away from taxpayers. Again, can't do this kind of arrangement for every major transportation project, but particularly on these toll road projects where you can, you should, but that because that does free up resources the government can use on projects where this model may not work. So ultimately, what do we get through these partnerships? This is next generation transportation. As you know, it's not just about concrete and steel, it's about technology and active management. It's about thinking about constituencies, travelers like customers. It's about linking toll to value, to a product that customers want to pay for. It's about looking at not just the highway infrastructure, but it's looking about how does that highway infrastructure integrate with transit to make improve mobility throughout a region. And it's about not just the government and not just the private sector, but the government and private sector working together from a finance and risk perspective to allocate risk to those best able to manage them, protect taxpayers, and to be able to get more for every transportation dollar that you have. So I'll leave it with there. We have great challenges here. We think this can be a solution in helping to meet those challenges, but would love to have your feedback or take any questions that you have in this late afternoon on the model. Gary, come on. You got one. Well, I personally go to Australia lots of times during the year, and I have to say we have people from all over the world here. And our Australian colleagues have done some amazing things. They have been pioneers in the use of public-private partnerships to meet infrastructure needs. And there are people here who represent from New South Wales and other areas that should be very proud of the work that they've done. And we have a lot to learn in the U.S. from that experience. At the same time, I'll say that we have a lot of Australian policymakers who come to the U.S. to see our hot lanes model. And they look at us at dynamic pricing and some of the technology where they're using it, and they say, well, we could never do something like that over in Australia. And I think the reality is that's why forums like this, and I have to give Virginia Tech a lot of credit, these kinds of forums are really important because we all have a lot to learn from one another in terms of what strategies work. We have a whole lot to learn from Australia in terms of public-private partnerships, but we are pushing the envelope when it comes to technology, innovation, active management, that I think our colleagues can learn from those projects. And often we find the concepts are much scarier than the reality when travelers see the benefits of those kinds of strategies. That makes a big difference. And I think here in the U.S., by linking a toll to such value, that I'm not just paying a toll to pay for a bridge, and then when the bridge is paid for, I take the toll off. I'm paying a toll to get home, and in exchange for that, I get home 2 hours faster. I can count on that trip. I don't have to build in that buffer time. There's real value to that. If we can shift thinking for tolling in the U.S. and other parts of the world, it really opens up the opportunity to use this tool more often and expands the tools we have in our toolbox to be able to meet these infrastructure challenges. So we're working on it. Yes, sir.
Can I ask two questions? You suggested that the choice came to people in real time in terms of cost. So if the regular lanes have virtually no traffic on them, does that mean that there is no toll or minimum toll? So presumably the toll is related to the degree of congestion, or is it not? The second question is whether you allow heavy goods vehicles. Yeah,
good question. So the toll is based on real-time traffic conditions. So it is a market-driven strategy. So the more demand or more traffic there is in the express lanes, the higher that toll is going to be. And so to answer your question, there's a base toll. It's in effect at all times. It covers the basic costs associated with the operations. It doesn't fully cover the cost, but there's a base toll. And then as traffic increases, you see that toll increase along with the traffic, based on demand. So while our average toll on 95 and 495, about $4 and $6, The toll range goes from about 50 cents up to last week, I think $30.80. So it really swings based on demand. Now, on that 50 cents, you're probably not saving any time. Probably the regular lanes are free flowing at that time. You pay that 50 cents. If you're paying $30, and there are not very many people who do, I think 90+% of our customers have never paid anything that high. But if you do, you're saving a lot of time. That's a 3-hour day. That's a really significant, something's happening out there on the network. But what we found is our customers are making the choice not just on the time that they're saving. So we have customers actually who use the network in the middle of the night and pay the toll, even though the regular lanes are free flowing. And we find the reason that they're doing that is they perceive, and the fact the reality is that it's safer. They like the reliability. So on the Beltway on Thursday morning at 8:30, it will range from 13 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour. And even in the middle of the afternoon, something happens, they know that they can rely on that trip. And we actually think, and those of you who've worked in the transit space, transit's always been, reliability is king in terms of transit. You'll use transit instead of the highway, even if the highway might be faster because the transit's more reliable. Hot lanes are the same. People are paying for that reliability because they don't have to build in a buffer time, and it should something unexpected happen out there.
Heavy goods vehicles?
Oh, heavy goods. So we do 2-axle vehicles only. 18-wheelers aren't allowed in express lanes by policy because they tend to be counter to faster and more reliable. But 2-axle vehicles use the lanes. We have a lot of great customers, FedEx trucks. We heard from someone the other day who runs a plumbing business, a maid service, where they have vehicles where 2-axle vehicles use the lanes very effectively and have incorporated them into their business because they see the value of time savings, but 2-axle only.
Just to report, in the UK then, we created a toll road to go parallel with one of our major roads. But the way that the contract was let to a private organisation was that the road had to be delivered back in 30 years in the state that it was originally created. So they effectively priced off heavy goods vehicles because they are the ones that do the most damage, and therefore, but the business in that case was flawed in one sense because it restricted the amount of traffic on it.
Yeah, and it goes to what your policy objectives are, I think, as a policymaker. And I think it's important to reiterate that through public-private partnerships, policymakers aren't giving and shouldn't give over the driving seat when it comes to what the priority policies are. Here in Virginia was very clear their number one priority was they wanted a reliable network for transit vehicles and for carpoolers or HOV. And so that, for them, for this network, trumped the movement of 18-wheelers and those kinds of things, and faster, more reliable was the priority. Same government, other part of the state, we're working on a tunnel project where the priority was the lowest toll possible. Well, we've got fluctuating tolls on our assets, the lowest toll possible down there, so that was a whole different transaction. And I think the point is, as government, you have a series of levers, and you can really structure these partnerships based on what your policy priorities are. Yeah, and one last comment on freight, because I just can't help it. On 95, interesting, we have about 30 miles of added capacity on 95 as part of these projects that were enabled through this partnership. And Virginia did a study somewhere 2010, 2011 on what would be the significant beneficiaries to the movement of freight through Virginia. And they found that the 95 express lanes was one of the most significant positive contributions to the movement of freight, because by adding that capacity, improving the mobility on the entire 95 network, your trucks are getting through there more quickly. And so you had that sort of secondary benefit for the movement of freight. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I wanted to make an analogy to the recent net neutrality debate. And I'm asking, so if we define neutrality as non-differentiated access to infrastructure, then are there those business models in which public and private entities can collaborate and both benefit while guaranteeing neutrality in service?
Yeah. Boy, that's a tough question. I'll answer the second one first. Can the public sector and private sector work together to provide service and meet both of their needs? And I believe and can say with great confidence that they can. And I think this network, particularly 95, is an example of that, where we only win when you align commercial objectives and policy objectives. And that's a challenging thing to do. But for these public-private partnerships to work, and I would say our network in Australia, lots of examples of how you've aligned commercial objectives and policy objectives to get an outcome. If we just make money and you're not meeting your policy objective, that's not a win. If we meet a policy objective and lose our shirts, that's not a win either. You've got to align those two objectives. And I think in the U.S., development of the P3 market, or the public-private partnership market in the U.S., we've been struggling to find those case studies where we hit that alignment. And I think we're there on this network. So I believe that you can do that. Now, in terms of access to everyone, if I take your question correctly, I think we also support that goal as well. If you look at the 95 corridor, unlike a lot of congested corridors in the country, and 95 is among the very worst, what we've offered now is there is heavy rail in that corridor. There's in the metro system, there's commuter rail and VRE, there's the metro system. We have about 490 buses going up and down that corridor every day. We have the regular lanes, we have the hot lanes, which are then funding additional capacity improvements. And I think when you look across that corridor, that's where we're striving to get to from a transportation perspective, where we have a whole range of options. And they're different options, but as a traveler, you're looking at and you see you have a whole range of options of which you can choose to use. And so I think we are providing options for everyone in that corridor. Every option isn't going to work for every person, but our goal, or the goal as a policymaker, certainly I think would be commendable to offer as many options as you can. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Along those lines, I'm curious, I guess you've already started to answer that question, but how does this fit in with other policy objectives related to environmental objectives like air quality and carbon pollution? It seems like maybe in the near term you're going to get a gain on those, but in the long term it might induce more driving. But at the same time, I see it's creating perhaps an incentive for carpools and more incentives for transit too, if it reduces transit time. So I was wondering if we looked at those bigger picture.
Definitely, and I think that's why we would call hot lanes generally a good next generation transportation solution. The Federal Highway Administration, I don't know if there's anyone here from the Federal Highway Administration. Oh, there you are. You can test that. I don't know how, you may know better than I. A few years ago, Federal Highway Administration actually deemed hot lanes a more sustainable transportation option and looked at the sustainability benefits, environmental sustainability benefits of hot lanes versus a traditional highway capacity expansion. And it's for the reasons that you talked about, in terms of not just adding capacity, but adding capacity while also providing opportunities for transit vehicles and also reducing, carbon emissions that come from stop and go congested traffic with that free flowing traffic. So I think it has been recognized as a more sustainable option. What we need to do is work as partners to ensure that we're maximizing the transit benefits of these projects. I will note it is also, in the case of the 495 express lanes, the government at the time actually did propose a traditional highway expansion that would have taken about 350 businesses. And we came in with a more innovative solution through an unsolicited proposal that had a smaller footprint and took that community and environmental impact down from 350 homes to just 8. So looking at streamlined design, some of those more innovative design solutions, we were able to reduce the environmental and community impact on the project as well.
We have one more.
So in terms of environments that are good lately versus bad, any sort of ideas or thoughts that you have on that? Where can you recognize, here's a good place to work, or here's one that's not?
Sure. Well, I was going to make a joke with my Australian colleagues that they woke up this morning with a new prime minister and how crazy that is. But then I thought, given our process, we'd probably in America welcome to wake up tomorrow and just have one and not have to go through the next 18, 16 months, right? But in terms of political environment, large transportation projects, any of us who have been involved in them know, large transportation projects by design are controversial. They're messy, they're political hot button issues. If you find one that's not, please let all the rest of us know how you did that, because they're big, messy projects. But I think what we're looking for in a politically stable environment is some measure of bipartisan support for transportation, for the model, and certainty of process, in the procurement process, in the selection process, in the evaluation of projects that minimizes late in the game political interruptions that often, as we all know, have nothing to do with the project itself. So you structure things. So for instance, if you look at that in a very tactical way, if you spend 10 years and millions of dollars developing a transportation solution, you don't want a legislative vote at the very end of that process. You want the policy setting at the very beginning of that process to minimize that risk, those kinds of things. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.